The air at the Henderson Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a humid Iowa blanket woven with the smells of diesel exhaust, stale coffee, and the sweet cloying scent of desperation. It was the spring of '73, and you could feel the money in the air. Corn was pushing $3 a bushel, beans were cresting 6, and every farmer with a pulse and a half-decent line of credit was looking to expand. Arthur Miller stood near the back, away from the frenetic energy of the auctioneer's chant. He ran a calloused thumb over the faded green paint of an old John Deere tool chest, its corners rounded from decades of use. He wasn't here for the big iron. He was here for the odds and ends, the forgotten treasures that bigger operators overlooked. Up front, the main event was underway. A brand-new, fire-engine-red International Harvester 1466 sat gleaming on the block, its tires still showing the little rubber nubs from the factory. The chrome exhaust pipe pointed at the sky like a silver finger of defiance. It was a beautiful machine, a symbol of the new era of farming, and Dale Peterson was determined to own it. Dale stood with his arms crossed, a cocky smirk plastered on his face. He'd already bought the Henderson 240 acres that adjoined his own property, a move that had the coffee shop buzzing for weeks. Now he needed the horsepower to work it. His bids were loud, sharp, cutting through the auctioneer's patter like a whip crack. He wasn't just buying a tractor, he was making a statement. Art watched him, a familiar tightness in his gut. He and Dale had grown up on neighboring farms, but they might as well have been from different planets. Art's father, a man forged in the crucible of the Great Depression, had preached one gospel. Debt is a tyrant. He'd run the Miller farm with a collection of tired but reliable farmalls and a John Deere A that he knew better than his own hands. He'd died with the deed to the farm, free and clear, in the top drawer of his dresser. That was the only inheritance that mattered to him, and to Art. Dale's father, on the other hand, had always chased the horizon. He'd been one of the first in the county to buy a diesel tractor, the first to get a self-propelled combine. And he'd died with a mountain of debt that Dale had inherited, and to everyone's surprise, managed to grow even larger. Dale saw debt not as a tyrant, but as a tool, a lever to move the world. The hammer fell, sold, to Mr. Dale Peterson for $22,500. A wave of applause and impressed murmurs rippled through the crowd. Dale took a theatrical bow, grinning like he'd just won the county fair. He swaggered through the crowd, accepting backpats and handshakes, his eyes scanning for someone. They landed on Art. "Well, Miller," Dale said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Picking through the scrap pile again. Find any good rusty bolts?" Art straightened up from the toolbox. "Just looking, Dale. Congratulations on the new tractor." "Thanks," Dale said, though it sounded more like a boast than an acknowledgement. "You gotta have the right tools for the job, you know? Can't make money turning wrenches on museum pieces." His eyes flicked toward the road where Art's pickup was parked. Everyone knew what Art drove to work the heavy ground. "That old Steiger of yours still running? I'm surprised the Smithsonian hasn't called you for it." A few of the men nearby chuckled. Art's four-wheel drive was a local legend, and not in a good way. It was a first-generation Steiger Wildcat, a brute of a machine from the late '60s, painted a strange, faded lime green. It was built like a battleship, with a screaming two-stroke Detroit diesel engine that you could hear 3 miles away on a clear day. It had no cab to speak of, just a windscreen and a canopy, and its controls were a confusing array of heavy levers that would give a modern operator fits. But it was paid for. "She runs," Art said quietly. "Running and earning are two different things," Dale shot back, his confidence swelling with his audience. "My 1466 will pull a 24-foot disc. I'll be done with my tillage before you even get that green monster started." "You can't make money going slow, Art. This is the '70s. You gotta get big or get out." Dale clapped a neighbor on the shoulder and moved on, leaving Art standing in the wake of his arrogance. The words hung in the air, echoing the sentiment of the whole county. Art was old-fashioned, a relic, too cautious. He was his father's son, afraid to take the risks necessary to succeed. Art felt the familiar sting of their judgment, but beneath it was a bedrock of conviction, laid down by his father's steady hands. Debt, his father used to say, his voice raspy from years of dust and unfiltered cigarettes, is a wolf you let into the henhouse. It eats whether you do or not. It don't care if it rains, it don't care if prices fall, it don't care if you get sick. It just eats. You remember that, boy? Art remembered. He picked up a heavy 3/4-inch combination wrench from the toolbox. It was a snap-on, old but perfectly balanced. He could feel the quality of the steel in his hand. It wasn't shiny, but it was strong. It would do the work. He bought the whole toolbox for $10. Before we go any further, I have to ask you folks listening, have you ever known someone like Dale who thought the newest and shiniest was always the best? Or were you raised more like Art, to make do and mend, and to fear the banker more than the breakdown? Let me know down in the comments which side of the fence you grew up on. It says a lot about a man. Driving home in his dusty Ford F100, Art thought about that Steiger. Dale called it a museum piece, but to Art it was the heart of his operation. He'd bought it 3 years ago from a farmer up north who was retiring. He paid $8,000 for it, cash. The farmer had thrown in a pallet of spare filters and a 500-page service manual that was thicker than a family Bible. Art had read that manual cover to cover until the pages were soft and stained with grease. He knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every hydraulic line. He knew the peculiar growl the 6V71 Detroit made just before it settled into its working rhythm, a sound like a giant tearing canvas. He knew that the third gear in the high range had a slight whine to it, and that you had to ease the clutch out just so to avoid a jarring lurch. It wasn't a tractor you just drove, it was a machine you had a relationship with. It demanded respect and understanding, and in return, it gave you raw, uncompromising power. That spring was a wet one, the kind of cold, miserable spring that seeps into your bones and makes every chore twice as hard. The fields were saturated, great brown sponges that turned to greasy mud the moment you put a tire on them. Art watched the sky, studied the ground, and waited. He walked his fields every morning, crumbling the black soil in his hands, feeling for the moisture. Dale, flush with the power of his new 1466 and a brand new 24-foot disc, got impatient. He hit his fields the first week of May, the big tractor roaring, leaving deep black ruts in its wake. From his own fence row, Art could see the IH struggling, its big tires churning and smearing the soil, compacting the life right out of it. Dale was fighting the ground, trying to beat it into submission with sheer horsepower. 2 days later, the rain came again. A steady, soaking drizzle that lasted for 48 hours. Dale's fields turned into a quagmire. His deep ruts became canals, holding water and sealing the surface. Art waited. He spent those 2 rainy days in his shop, methodically going over his planter, a 6-row John Deere 7000 that he'd bought used but had rebuilt from the ground up. He checked the seed meters, calibrated the depth gauges, and greased every moving part until it moved with silent precision. When the sun finally broke through, Art gave the ground 1 more day to dry. The next morning, under a pale yellow sky, he fired up his old, reliable John Deere 4020. The tractor was 20 years Dale's junior, a classic from '68, but it was his go-to for planting. It was lighter, more nimble. Paired with the 6-row planter, it floated over the soil, leaving minimal tracks. He worked steadily, methodically, the synchro-range transmission shifting with a satisfying clunk, the diesel engine humming its familiar, dependable tune. He got his corn in the ground in 3 good days, the soil crumbling perfectly over the seeds. Meanwhile, Dale was in a bind. His fields were still too wet for his heavy equipment. He had to wait another 4 days, fuming as he watched Art finish up. When he finally got back in, he had to work the ground a second time to break up the crust the rain had formed over his compacted tracks. He was a full week behind, his planting window shrinking, his fuel bill mounting. It was a small thing, a quiet victory that no one in the coffee shop would ever talk about. But Art felt it. He hadn't beaten Dale with speed or power, he'd beaten him with patience and a deep understanding of the land. The old ways, his father's ways, still had their place. The real test, however, came a month later, during the first cultivation. The corn was knee-high and the weeds were coming on strong. This was a job for the Steiger. Art needed its power to pull his big 12-row cultivator. He backed the tractor out of the shed, the big articulated frame groaning as it flexed. He climbed up into the simple steel seat, turned the key and pushed the starter button. The Detroit diesel spun, then caught with a deafening roar and a puff of blue smoke. The whole machine vibrated with raw, untamed energy. He eased it out into the field, the engine screaming its high-pitched song. He was halfway down the first pass when he felt it. A slight hesitation when he lifted the cultivator wings, a sponginess in the hydraulic lever. He stopped at the end of the row and tried the hydraulics again. The wings lifted, but slowly, shuddering. He shut the engine down, the sudden silence ringing in his ears. He climbed down and ran his hand along the main hydraulic line that ran from the pump back to the valve block. His fingers came away slick with warm oil. A pinhole leak, right at the fitting. He sighed. A simple failure, but one that could shut him down for a day if he had to run to town for parts. But Art was never unprepared. He walked back to the shop and went to a steel cabinet his father had built. On the third shelf, in a neatly labeled coffee can, were dozens of hydraulic fittings and O-rings. He'd salvaged them over the years, cleaned them and sorted them. His father had called it the just-in-case cabinet. He found a matching fitting and a new O-ring. The job was greasy and awkward. He had to lie on his back under the belly of the beast, the smell of diesel and hot hydraulic fluid filling his nostrils. He used 2 big crescent wrenches, straining against the tight connection. The old fitting finally broke loose with a groan of protesting steel. He cleaned the threads, installed the new fitting with its fresh O-ring, and tightened it down until his knuckles were white. An hour later, he was back in the seat. He fired up the Detroit, and the cultivator wings lifted smoothly, powerfully. He was back to work. That same afternoon, Dale's brand new 1466 sat silent at the end of a field. A single red light was glowing on its sophisticated dashboard console. Dale stood beside it, hands on his hips, staring at the engine as if it had personally betrayed him. He didn't know what the light meant, and the operator's manual was still in the plastic wrap back at his house. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He went to the house and called the dealer. The mechanic said he could be out, but it wouldn't be until the next morning. A day and a half of downtime, waiting for a specialist to fix a problem he didn't understand on a machine he was still paying for. The weeds in his fields didn't wait. They just kept growing. At the co-op a week later, the talk was all about Dale's bad luck. "Can you believe it?" one farmer said over a cup of bitter coffee. 22 grand for a tractor, and it breaks down in the first 100 hours. A faulty sensor, the mechanic said. Cost him $500 for the service call. "That's the trouble with all this new electronic garbage," another chimed in. "Give me a good old Farmall M. I can fix anything on that with a hammer and a pair of pliers." Art sat at the counter, listening. He never said a word about his own breakdown, about the 1-hour fix that cost him nothing but a little grease on his hands. No one asked. They were too busy marveling at the size of Dale's repair bill and, in a strange way, respecting him for being able to afford it. They saw Dale's problem as a big problem, fit for a big operator. They would have seen Art's problem as insignificant, the kind of cheap nuisance you'd expect from old junk. They didn't see the difference between writing a check and turning a wrench. They saw a $500 bill. Art saw a full day of lost time. He knew which one was more expensive. The years began to blur together, each one marked by the rhythm of planting and harvest. The mid-70s arrived, and with them came a wave of prosperity unlike anything the Heartland had ever seen. The Russian grain deal had opened the floodgates. Prices for corn and soybeans shot into the stratosphere and stayed there. Land values, which had been climbing steadily, suddenly exploded. A good 80 acres that might have sold for $800 an acre in 1970 was now fetching $2,000, even $3,000. The banks, flush with cash from deposits in oil-rich nations, were practically begging farmers to take out loans. "Leverage your assets," the men in suits said. "Buy that neighboring farm. The value will double in 5 years. You can't lose." It was a heady time, a gold rush in the cornfields, and no one rode the wave higher than Dale Peterson. He became the poster child for the new agriculture. He bought another 320 acres, pushing his operation to nearly 1,000 acres. To work it, he traded in the 1466, which was barely 3 years old, for one of the first international 2+2 tractors. the Snoopy tractor, a strange-looking but powerful machine. When that didn't seem like enough, he went to the John Deere dealer and financed a brand new 8630, a massive 8-wheeled articulated 4-wheel drive that dwarfed Art's old Steiger. It had a soundproofed cab with air conditioning, a radio, and a seat that floated on air. It was a spaceship compared to Art's open station clunker. Dale built a new machine shed, a massive pole barn of gleaming steel that could hold his entire line of equipment. He put up 2 new 50,000-bushel grain bins with a state-of-the-art drying system and a leg elevator. His farmstead, which had once been as modest as any other, now looked like a corporate headquarters. His wife drove a new Lincoln Continental, and there was talk he was looking at buying a small airplane. The community watched in awe. Dale was a success story, a visionary. He was playing the game and winning. And every time he drove his new air-conditioned equipment past Art's place, he'd give a little wave, a gesture that was less a greeting and more a reminder of the gulf that had opened between them. Art felt the pressure. Every trip to the co-op, every conversation at the seed dealer was a fresh assault on his philosophy. Men who had once farmed alongside his father now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You sitting on a gold mine, Art," his neighbor to the east, a man named George, told him one afternoon over the fence. "Your land's all paid for. The bank would give you $1 million loan tomorrow just on the equity. You could buy me out, buy Peterson's new piece. You could be the biggest operator in the county." "What would I do with all that land, George?" Art asked. "Farm it. Make money." "What do you think?" George said, exasperated. "You're living in the past. Your dad was a good man, but his time is over. You got to take risks." Art just nodded. He didn't bother to explain. How could he describe the cold knot of dread that formed in his stomach when he heard talk of $1 million loans and interest rates that were starting to creep up? He saw the high grain prices not as a new permanent reality, but as a temporary peak, a high tide that would eventually have to go out. And he knew that when the tide went out, you found out who was swimming naked. He took his profits, which were good, better than they'd ever been, and he used them to harden his position. He didn't buy more land. Instead, he systematically improved what he had. He tiled a wet 80 that had always been a problem. He rebuilt the fences his father had put up 30 years before. He replaced the roof on the old barn, and in his shop he continued to invest in good, used equipment that he could pay for with cash. He sold the old 4020 and bought a meticulously cared-for John Deere 4430 with low hours. It was a step up, with a cab and air conditioning, but it was a 10-year-old tractor, not a new one. He replaced his old 6-row planter with a used 12-row Kinsey, which he then stripped down and rebuilt to his own exacting standards. His biggest purchase was a used International Harvester 1440 combine. It was one of the new axial flow models, a revolutionary design, but he'd bought it after it had taken its biggest hit of depreciation. While Dale was signing the papers for a brand new, top-of-the-line 1480, Art was hauling his 1440 home on a lowboy trailer, already making a list in his head of the bearings he would replace and the chains he would check before it ever touched a field of his own. He was a ghost at the auctions, a shadow in the coffee shop, the man who could have been king, content to be a peasant. They saw him as a failure, a man paralyzed by fear, forever living in the shadow of his Depression-era father. They saw his caution as weakness, his discipline as a lack of ambition. One evening in the late fall of 1979, Art was in his workshop replacing a worn-out bearing on the combine's feeder house. The air was cold, smelling of steel and oil. The radio on the shelf was murmuring quietly, tuned to a station out of Des Moines. He was only half listening to the farm report, hog prices, cattle futures, when a different voice cut in. A newsman talking about the national economy. He spoke of runaway inflation, of a new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker, who was determined to break inflation's back, no matter the cost. The newsman used a phrase Art had never heard before: prime interest rate. He said it had just climbed to a shocking 15%. Dale, at the co-op the next day, laughed it off. "It's just for the big city banks," he scoffed to the morning crowd. "It won't affect our operating loans. The government knows they can't do that to the farmers. We feed the world." But a week later, a letter came from the bank. It was a standard notice informing all agricultural clients that due to changes in federal monetary policy, the interest rate on all operating loans for the coming season would be adjusted. The new rate was 18%. Art read the letter twice. He felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the November wind rattling the window pane. He walked out to his machine shed and flipped on the lights. The fluorescent bulbs hummed to life, casting a sterile glow on his equipment. The 4430, the Kinzer planter, the 1440 combine, and in the back, silent and massive, the old Steiger Wildcat. They were all his. No bank held the paper on them. No loan officer could take them away. For the first time, the other farmer's mockery and pity didn't sting. He looked at the old green monster, its paint faded, its design archaic. Dale had called it slow, a museum piece, and he was right. It was slow, but its greatest strength wasn't its horsepower or its speed. Its greatest strength was the simple, beautiful fact that it was paid for. In a world of 18% interest, that was the only number that mattered. The wolf was at the door of every farm in the county, and Art knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was about to start eating. The spring of 1980 broke hot and early. The rains that usually soaked the black Iowa soil through April and May never came. Instead, a relentless sun beat down from a hazy, washed-out sky. By June, the corn, which should have been shoulder-high and deep green, was stunted and pale, its leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, as if in prayer for a single drop of water. The ground, once a forgiving loam, hardened into something resembling brick. Cracks snaked across the fields, some wide enough to swallow a wrench. The 18% interest rate was no longer a theoretical threat whispered about in the co-op. It was a hungry beast, gnawing at the cash reserves of every farmer in the county. With the crop withering in the fields, the numbers simply didn't work. The cost of borrowing money to put the crop in the ground was now higher than the potential profit from the crop itself, even in a good year. And this was not a good year. The stress was a palpable thing. You could see it in the faces of the men at the gas station, their usual easy banter replaced by clipped, anxious conversations about the forecast. You could see it in the way they drove, too fast and too hard down the gravel roads, trailing clouds of dust like plumes of desperation. Dale Peterson felt the pressure more than anyone. His massive operation, with its 1,000 acres and $500,000 in loans, was a thirsty giant. His monthly interest payments to the bank were more than Art Miller made in an entire year. Every morning, Dale would stand at the edge of his fields, staring at the sickly corn, the swagger gone from his shoulders, replaced by a heavy slump. His only hope was to get his soybeans planted into the last bit of subsoil moisture. He had to work the ground deep, break up the concrete-like crust to give the seeds a fighting chance. It was a job for his magnificent John Deere 8630, the king of his fleet. He fired it up one sweltering afternoon, the air-conditioned cab a welcome refuge from the oppressive heat. He dropped the 30-foot chisel plow into the earth, and the big tractor bucked as the shanks fought against the unyielding soil. The Cummins engine roared, black smoke pouring from the chrome stack as it strained under the immense load. He was 3 passes in when a warning light, a small, insistent red eye, began to flash on the sophisticated console. A high-pitched alarm followed, cutting through the music on the radio. Hydraulic oil temperature was critical. Dale lifted the plow and watched the gauge. The needle was buried in the red. He shut the tractor down and climbed out into the blast furnace of the afternoon. He knew enough to check the hydraulic fluid level. It was fine. He checked the radiator and the hydraulic oil cooler in front of it. They were packed solid with dry chaff and dust from the field. He spent the next hour with an air hose, blowing out the coolers until he was caked in a layer of grime. Confident he'd solved the problem, he climbed back into the cab and started it up. The light stayed off. He put the tractor in gear, dropped the plow, and the light immediately began to flash again. The alarm screamed. It wasn't a simple overheating issue. It was something deeper, something in the complex, closed-center hydraulic system that he didn't begin to understand. He called the dealer. The service manager's voice was frayed. "I'm sorry, Dale," he said. "I've got 3 guys out and a waiting list a mile long. Tractors are going down all over the county in this heat. I might be able to get someone out there by Friday." Friday was 3 days away. 3 days of relentless sun, baking the last remnant of moisture from the soil. 3 days of interest payments, ticking away like a time bomb. 2 miles down the road, Art Miller was also chiseling. He was in the open seat of the Steiger Wildcat, fully exposed to the sun and the dust. There was no air conditioning, only the hot wind and the deafening roar of the 6V71 Detroit diesel just a few feet in front of him. The sound was immense, a physical presence that vibrated through the steel seat and up his spine. He wore a sweat-stained cap pulled low and a pair of heavy ear protectors. The old tractor was a brute. It didn't have the finesse or the features of Dale's John Deere, but it had something more important: simplicity. Its hydraulic system was a straightforward open-center design, powered by a massive gear pump that was as reliable as an anvil. It ran hot, but it was designed to. Art kept his eye on the simple temperature gauge he'd added to the dash. When it started to creep up, he'd simply lift the chisel plow for 100 yards at the end of a pass, letting the system cool in the open air before dropping it back in. He worked slower than Dale could, but he never stopped. On the second day, a universal joint on the main drive shaft between the transmission and the transfer case began to click. A small metallic sound lost in the engine's roar but felt through the floor plates. Art stopped immediately. He knew that sound. It was the needle bearings giving out. If it failed completely, it could take the whole drive shaft with it. He drove the tractor back to the shop. He didn't call a dealer. He crawled underneath with a wrench and a pry bar. An hour later, the drive shaft was on his workshop floor. He went to a steel bin bolted to the wall, a bin filled with dozens of U-joints he'd collected over the years. He found a match, a heavy-duty spicer joint he'd pulled off an old semi-truck. He pressed the old one out and the new one in with his 20-ton shop press. By sunset, the Steiger was back together, greased and ready for the next day. The repair cost him nothing but time and a few smudges of grease. By the time the John Deere mechanic finally arrived at Dale's farm on Friday, Dale's planting window was gone. The mechanic hooked up his diagnostic gauges and spent 2 hours tracing lines. The verdict was a failed thermal bypass valve deep inside the main hydraulic pump. It was a $500 part that would have to be ordered. It would take another week. The final repair bill, including the service calls and labor, would be over $2,000. Dale stood in the parched field, looking at his silent, multi-ton monument to modern agriculture. He had the biggest and the best, but it was useless. That evening, for the first time, the coffee shop talk wasn't about Dale's success. It was about the bright green tractor 2 miles away, the one without a cab, the one they all called a relic. It was still out there, its strange high-pitched scream echoing across the valley in the twilight, pulling a chisel plow through the stubborn earth, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of a farm that refused to die. The drought of 1980 was the first crack in the dam. The farm crisis of the following years was the flood that broke it completely. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union caused commodity prices to collapse overnight. Corn that had been selling for over $3 a bushel plummeted to less than $2. At the same time, the Federal Reserve, in its war on inflation, pushed the prime rate to an unimaginable 21%. It was a perfect storm: high interest, low prices, and the catastrophic collapse of land values. The very foundation of the boom, leveraged equity, crumbled. Farms that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre were suddenly worth less than $1,000, wiping out the collateral on which billions of dollars in loans had been secured. The letters from the bank started as polite notices, then became stern warnings, and finally formal declarations of foreclosure. The countryside was filled with the grim sight of auction signs hammered into the ends of farm lanes, white flags of surrender. Every week the local paper was thick with auction bills, listing lifetimes of work to be sold off in a single brutal afternoon. Dale Peterson's empire, built on the shifting sands of debt, was one of the first and biggest to fall. His operating loan was called. His equipment loans were in default. The bank that had once courted him with promises of unlimited credit now treated him like a stranger. The banker, a man Dale used to golf with, wouldn't even take his calls anymore. Dale's auction was scheduled for a cold, grey Saturday in November of '83. It felt like a funeral. The crowd was quiet, their faces grim. These weren't buyers flush with cash and optimism like at the Henderson auction 10 years prior. These were neighbors, friends, watching the dismemberment of a man's life, all of them knowing they could be next. The equipment was lined up in a long, sad row. The gleaming steel of the new machine shed seemed to mock the scene. The John Deere 8630, Dale's pride and joy, sat silent, a sticker from the auction company plastered on its window. It had less than 1,500 hours on it. Dale had paid over $100,000 for it just a few years before. The bidding was slow, agonizing. It finally sold for $35,000, not even enough to satisfy the lien John Deere held on it. The bank would get the rest. One by one, his assets were liquidated for pennies on the dollar. The big Kinzer planter, the International 1480 combine, the grain trucks. Each fall of the auctioneer's hammer was like a nail in a coffin. Art was there, standing near the back, just as he had been 10 years ago. He wasn't there to gloat or to pick over the bones. He felt a profound sadness. He saw Dale standing alone by the house, his face pale and slack, watching the dream he had built be torn apart and hauled away. Dale wasn't an enemy. He was a casualty of a system that had encouraged his ambition and then punished him for it. While Dale's world was imploding, Art's was holding steady. The crisis was painful for him too. The low prices meant his profits were razor thin. But he had no crushing interest payments. His break-even point was half of what Dale's had been. He made do. He sold a few hogs to make his property tax payment. His wife took a part-time job at the local library. They cut back on everything, but they held on. His old, paid-for equipment was his salvation. The Steiger, the 4430, the 1440 combine. They weren't just machines. They were his partners in survival. They didn't require massive loan payments, only fuel, grease, and Art's own 2 hands. He knew every bolt and wire. When a bearing went out on the combine during the bean harvest, he didn't lose 3 days waiting for a mechanic. He had a spare on the shelf and was running again in 4 hours. In an economy where time was the only thing more expensive than money, his ability to fix his own machinery was the ultimate advantage. He was surviving not by getting bigger, but by being resilient. He was a rock in the middle of a flood, and the waters of the crisis, which had swept away so many others, simply flowed around him. The last major items to be sold at Dale's auction were the land parcels. The crowd grew even quieter. This was the final act, the selling of the earth itself. The first parcel was the 320 acres Dale had bought during the boom. It sold for a quarter of what he had paid. Then came the original Peterson home quarter, the 160 acres his grandfather had homesteaded. This was the heart of it all. Dale's wife came out of the house and stood beside him, her arm linked through his. She was crying silently. The auctioneer started the bidding. It was slow. No one had the money or the nerve. The price stalled at a heartbreakingly low number. A man representing the bank stepped forward, ready to buy it back for the lender. "Do I have another bid?" the auctioneer called out, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. "Going once, going twice." From the back of the crowd, a clear voice said, "I bid $100 more." Every head turned. It was Art Miller. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Art never bought land. He was the man who sat on what he had. The bankman, annoyed, raised the bid. Art immediately raised it again. They went back and forth, Art's bids calm and steady, the bankman's increasingly irritated. Finally, the bankman shook his head and stepped back. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, pointing a finger at Art. "To Mr. Art Miller." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Art had just bought the Peterson home place. He walked over to the auctioneer's clerk and wrote out a check. Not from a bank loan, but from a savings account he had been carefully feeding for 20 years, an account his father had helped him start. It was money earned from good harvests, saved from extravagant purchases, and protected from the ravages of interest. He then walked over to where Dale and his wife were standing, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. He didn't look at Dale, he looked at Dale's wife. "Ma'am," Art said quietly, holding out a piece of paper. It was a simple, handwritten rental agreement. "I'm not a landlord. I don't know the first thing about it. I'm going to need someone to look after this place for me, someone who knows the ground." Dale looked at the paper. Art was offering to rent the farm back to him. The terms were a 1/3 crop share, with an option to buy it back from Art for exactly what Art had paid for it, plus a modest amount for property taxes any time in the next 10 years. It wasn't a business deal, it was a lifeline. Dale stared at Art, his eyes welling up. The arrogance, the rivalry, the years of mockery. It all melted away, leaving only the raw humility of a broken man being offered an impossible grace. He couldn't speak, he just nodded, a single jerky motion. Art clapped him gently on the shoulder. "We're neighbors, Dale," he said. "That's supposed to mean something." He turned and walked back to his truck, leaving the rental agreement in Dale's trembling hand. The story of what happened at the Peterson auction traveled through the county like a prairie fire. In the coffee shop, the talk was no longer about interest rates or foreclosures. It was about Art Miller. The men who had once pitied him now spoke his name with a new kind of respect. They finally understood. Art's wealth wasn't measured in acres or the color of his equipment. It was measured in his freedom. Freedom from the bank, freedom from fear, freedom to act with honor and decency when it mattered most. His father's old-fashioned wisdom was no longer seen as a weakness, but as a kind of prophecy that had come true. The years that followed were healing years for the heartland. The economy slowly recovered. Land prices stabilized. Farming became a business of tight margins and careful planning. Not a high-stakes gamble. Dale Peterson never did get big again. He farmed his home quarter, the one Art had saved for him, and did it well. He and Art became unlikely friends. They shared equipment, helped each other during harvest, and spent long hours in Art's workshop, leaning against a workbench and talking about the weather, the markets, and the quirks of old machinery. Dale eventually bought the farm back, just as the agreement had allowed. He paid for it with 10 years of hard work and careful management, the way Art would have done it. The rivalry was long dead, replaced by a bond forged in the fires of the crisis. One crisp October afternoon, years later, Art was in the shed with his grandson, a boy of about 12 with grease on his cheek and a keen interest in anything with an engine. They were working on the old Steiger. It wasn't the main tillage tractor anymore. Art had since bought a newer, more comfortable 4-wheel drive. But he never sold the old green monster. It was a part of him, a part of the farm's story. "Grandpa," the boy asked, tightening a bolt with a wrench, "why do we keep this old thing? It's so loud and shaky." Art stopped what he was doing and looked at the tractor, its lime green paint almost completely faded, its massive frame a testament to an era of overbuilt simplicity. He thought of Dale's shiny new 1466, of the gleaming John Deere 8630, and of the auctioneer's somber chant. "Well," Art said, running a hand over the tractor's thick steel fender, "this old tractor taught me a lesson. Lots of people thought the most important thing was to be fast, to be the biggest. They thought speed and power were strengths." He looked at his grandson, making sure the boy was listening. But they were wrong. In tough times, the real strength isn't how fast you can go forward. It's how well you can stand your ground. This tractor, it doesn't have a computer. It doesn't have air conditioning. But it has something more important. "What's that?" the boy asked. Art smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "It doesn't have a payment book. Your great-grandpa used to say that debt is a wolf you let into the henhouse. It eats whether you do or not. This old tractor, it never ate when we couldn't afford to feed it. It just waited. It was patient. And it was always ready to work when the time was right." He turned the key, and with a push of the button, the 6V71 Detroit diesel roared to life, its iconic, ear-splitting scream filling the machine shed. It was a sound that had once been mocked as obsolete. But to Art, and to a generation of farmers who had survived the storm, it was the sound of endurance. It was the sound of freedom. It was the sound of a legacy, not of acres owned or dollars made, but of a farm saved, a neighbor helped, and a quiet truth vindicated.